welcome to this another in our webinar series. This is our members information session where each month we seek to address a pertinent topic affecting the small business sector here in Barbados and beyond. So welcome again. This morning, it is indeed a pleasure to have the Acting Chief Labour Officer with us. A little bit about our presenter, Mrs. Claudette Hope-Greenidge is currently acting in this capacity as CLO with the Ministry of Labour, and she has some 28 years experience in the area of labour administration, spanning the areas of occupational safety and health, employment services, and employment relations. She was directly involved in the drafting of some of the contemporary pieces of labor legislation, including the Safety and Health at Work Act, Employment Rights Act, Sexual Harassment Prevention Act, Employment Prevention of Discrimination Act, and the draft regulations to the Safety and Health at Work Act. Her special interests are ergonomics, human resource development, training facilitation, and dispute resolution. Mrs. Hope-Greenidge is a graduate of the University of the West Indies, Cape Hill campus, where she obtained her undergraduate degree and a postgraduate diploma in environmental studies and resource management. She also holds a Master's of Science degree in work design and ergonomics from the University of Birmingham, and MSc in Human Resource Management from the University of Surrey. She's conducted research on the impact of procurement and contracting practices on health and safety in the construction sector in the UK, while assigned to the National Health and Safety Laboratory. This is an agency of the Health and Safety Executive in the United Kingdom. The resulting research paper has been published by that agency, so we congratulate her on that effort. A further research includes the study of the effects of shift work systems on work-life balance among certain categories of public sector employees in Barbados. And so, ladies and gentlemen, you would agree from that very short bio sketch that our presenter this morning is more than competent to address this topic for us. So without any further ado, I welcome you to our webinar today and invite you now to sit back and receive the presentation from Mrs. Claudette Hope-Greenidge, the Acting Chief Labour Officer, Ministry of Labour and Social Partnership Relations. Good morning again and welcome. Over to you, Claudette.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, if there are any on the call. Yes, I see at least one on my screen to start, but I'm sure there's some gentlemen. And thank you to the SBA, and thank you very much, Senator, for inviting me to be a part of the education and enlightenment for your members and any members of the public whom you also facilitate. This morning, we will be looking between 11 and noon, but I can comfortably spend all day, but it will only take you up to noon, looking at the do's and don'ts of remote work. And that will be principally against the context of the now what we refer to as the COVID-19 environment. But indeed, remote work is something that has been around for pretty much as there has been work, and particularly when technology became much more integrated into work. And the COVID-19 situation here in our context has forced us into looking at other work arrangements a bit more. And remote work has developed as one of those. Now, I will go through the presentation with you, and I'll leave ample time so you're still getting very, very many of those questions and so on by the time we reach noon. If we're looking at what is remote work, Now, when it comes to looking at how we define things in the world of work, and when we're looking for common ground, as a member of the ILO, we normally look to that agency for some guidance. And the ILO defines and addresses everything. And they do have a concept, an outline for the concept of remote work. And remote work is used interchangeably with the term working from home, or as I prefer to say, working from at home. And so you may hear me refer to remote work or WFM. The two terms, as I said, used interchangeably, but are not to be confused with things like telework and telecommuting. Those have slightly different arrangements, and they may be even more remote than what we refer to as remote work. So remote work or working from at home is a working arrangement where a worker fulfills his or her responsibilities, the essential responsibilities of the job, while remaining at home principally. And that would be different to what is happening now, where we have some persons from outside of the region who are here working. That is more telework. And with remote work, there's a heavy emphasis on using information and communications technology to get the job done. But we will see as we go through the question you also have to ask yourself, using information communication technology, but there are also some tasks that can be done at home. And maybe you can start thinking of that, where it may not be necessary to use technology in the same way. The only technology you may need in the case like that may be a telephone, smartphone, as we have these days. So in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, another thing to bear in mind is that remote work is being seen as a temporary or alternative work arrangement. But we do know that some persons now have been in the remote work frame of mind since March, a year, March last year. So when it comes to looking at it as temporary, we will see just how that works out. And an important principle in looking at remote work and getting things organized there is that when you're working remotely, there must be shared responsibility and shared commitment on the part of both the employer and the employee to ensure that business continues, that employment continues. So that is something that is quite important in the context of remote work, as it is in any other type of working arrangement. Now, I am going to start to share my screen, and it will work. Yes, and I do believe I'm seeing it here, so I do believe that everybody is seeing it, right? Yes. If nobody is, Mario will sort it out for me. So that was the definition, but I believe you will have access to this information. The legal framework is the next factor that we need to look at. Now, working remotely does not mean that anything is stripped away. You're doing just that. You're working remotely. Your terms and conditions essentially remain the same, except that in some cases there may be a need for a bit of flexibility. But some of the key pieces of legislation you need to bear in mind would be the Employment Rights Act, the Safety and Health at Work Act, the Shops Act, because amongst your membership, you would have some persons who operate in the retail sector on a small scale. There's also the Holidays with Pay Act, which we have been hearing quite a bit about in recent times, particularly over the last year. And now we have two new pieces of legislation that will also have to be borne in mind. The Employment Prevention of Discrimination Act, which is the most recent, that was December last year, and the Employment Sexual Harassment Prevention Act. You may be wondering how those two fit in, but we will see. And I have a question there. The legislation, even the 2020 legislation, certainly did not contemplate a pandemic. So But at the same time, when you look at the legislation, we still have enough to hold on to help us manage in the context of a pandemic. So it wasn't contemplated, but because they were so well written, they do provide enough to cushion any concerns, misgivings, and so on that employers or employees may have when it comes to approaching remote work and what is now happening the world over. As we go on, there's some factors that we need to take account of when you are contemplating moving to remote work, when you are actually in the scheme of remote work. And those success factors are pretty much the same things that obtain on a daily basis in the world of work. So one thing you need to bear in mind again is that remote work does not mean you need to use a different approach to employer-employee relationships. It doesn't mean, as I said before, that anything is stripped away. It doesn't mean that you don't consider safety and health, but there's an interesting twist on how you deal with safety and health. What it has brought to the fore a bit more, though, is that there's some, I don't want to say new, but there's some other factors that have come more to the fore. And if we start from the bottom and go up, which is unconventional, mental health, physical health, work-life balance. These are things that have always been around, but we have seen over the course of the last year how important it is for those things to be maintained when it comes to the employer-employee relationships. Industrial relations, we do know that we still need to have a focus there, occupational safety and health, and the general employer-employee relationship. Now, with the employer-employee relationship, there is the contract of service. We're not looking at contracts for service, contract of service. I made an offer as the employer. The person who looked over the offer accepted. We formed an employment relationship. That contract, that relationship in the context of remote work is now, as I say, portable. It is not in the bricks and mortar location. It is now wherever that person is doing the work. So in some cases, if your organization has 80 persons, 100 persons, consider that your workplace is now spread over those 80 or 100 households with different dynamics, different factors, different scenarios playing out daily. And those things also have to be taken account of by both the employer and the employee. With regard to the industrial relations end of things, what happens in terms of holiday, what happens with leave, whether it is sick leave or leave where you need to have time off to do certain personal things, where those things may be written into your contract. Consider that those things still remain. The question may be you're working at home and you have a doctor's appointment, for example. Should your employee be able to just say, well, I'm working at home, my appointment is 9 o'clock, I will go off to the appointment at 9 o'clock. When I return, then I will log back in and do whatever I need to do. Not necessarily so. The same rules that would apply in forming, seeking permissions on the part of the employer, and the same expectations and rules to some extent that would apply on the part of the employer, facilitating, exercising reasonable care for the needs of the employee and so on. Those things continue. As far as industrial relations is concerned, we have seen that that has continued using the technology. So if there are matters of discipline, for example, if there are other ERA matters that you need to manage in the workplace, you use the technology as far as it's possible. So working from at home or working remotely can be done successfully in the main, but of course there are always those outliers. Occupational safety and health, that factor is principally seen now through the whole application of ergonomics. It was in the workplace ergonomics in the bricks and mortar location. You're at home now, it still continues. What happens with your workstation setup? Who advises? How do you advise? Those are the factors that will come to the fore. The Safety and Health at Work Act is still there. How is it going to be applied? The matter of work-life balance is also one that is important. There has been a general blurring of the lines between work and home. And in the physical sense, your kitchen countertop, your dining room table, your bedroom, in some cases, your patio, those places have become places of work. Life still has to go on. Regular home life still has to go on. How do you juggle all those things, making sure that what is to be done for work is done, what is to be done in terms of regular life, looking after children, looking after elderly parents, looking after yourself. Just how do those things continue? And employers and employees have a role there to play in terms of voicing their wants, the desires, their expectations, so that the best possible outcome can be realized. That ties in with physical health, and there's also the aspect of mental health, which that's an area of specialty, so I wouldn't elaborate on that. But sufficient to say that the mental health aspect, the world over, and Barbados is no exception, where there are, some questions not being raised on the real impact of this whole situation on mental health. And mental health from the point of view of some persons may be in situations where it is difficult. There is your employee, but coming to work may be that person's refuge. Being away from that particular setting between 9 and 5 or 8 and 4:30. So how do you deal with things like that? Some employees may not be handling the isolation well. Isolation, not in terms of COVID, but being apart from colleagues, the quick conferences and the interaction. So those are things that you still need to bear in mind and to keep your fingers on as far as your employees would be concerned. Now, rights and responsibilities. I said earlier, the legal rights and responsibilities remain in force. Then you need to look at the arrangements for the at-home work situation. You need to decide on which tasks, on which roles can be performed successfully, 100% or with some great degree of success at home. Now, the question is, there are some roles that can't be performed at home. For example, you're a small company and you have your receptionist, the persons in production, or your customer service persons. You also have the person who is your ancillary person, your maid, your general worker. That person can work from home. So then you need to look to see how it is going to happen. Sometimes these things throw up new opportunities, new ways of doing things. The person may be the general worker, maybe the maid in the workplace, but the person may be able to maneuver the technology. So there may be some other role that can be assigned to that person. So that's now going into the industrial relations end of it, looking at what happens if you're going to upskill and upscale a person, or if you will take your losses, not necessarily in monetary terms only, but come up with what is the best legal and human-centered approach to that person who cannot do their duties while at home. Your HR capabilities and your information technology capabilities need to be strongest now. because with the HR capability, monitoring and measurement still has to go on because the business is continuing. So monitoring and measurement still has to go on. So I don't know how much in terms of the membership, things like performance appraisal um, and frequent review of performance and so on, how often that may be done by some members, but that still has to be done. It is not necessarily something that has to be based on the number of keystrokes or when a person logs in or logs off. All those are things that can come into it, but you look to see how what you were doing normally, how that can be migrated, and if it can't, you need to look for the next best possible alternative to having that there. But the HR persons must be just as available or even more available as they would be in the case of the bricks and mortar location. IT support is absolutely critical. Just like your Mr. Mario, a wonderful experience getting started out for today. Dialogue between employers and employees must also continue. That's important. And that in terms of Barbados, that is central to how we approach matters at the workplace level. Dialogue. Bipartite, if necessary, it goes up tripartite if you need to include your workers' representatives or your employers' representatives and so on. Another aspect you need to consider as well is in terms of your at-home work situation, short-term or long-term. Are you going to use a pure remote working system or a hybrid system? Where the pure system, meaning you have determined this is the way we will go for maybe the life of the next directive or the next 3 months or the next 2 months. Or alternatively, you may choose to adopt a hybrid system as we have in this ministry, in our ministry here in department, where working hours are different and you will do some days at home and some days in the workplace according to a defined schedule. Right? And that serves two purposes. It helps to maintain a connection between what used to happen, not that it must continue, but it helps to maintain connection and collaboration amongst the employees. And it also, as we know in this context now, looks after the public health requirement. So you will consider, which system you want to use, the pure, the hybrid, and as well working out your schedule. Is it directive by directive, or is it over a longer term while we wait to see what happens with this COVID-19? So we see then that the workplace is now extended, as we said, is in disparate places. It is in the 150, 20, or 10 places where your employees live. And to some extent, then the workplace is redefined. The contract of employment, as we said, moves with the person. It is not abandoned and it cannot be abandoned. So those terms remain. But an interesting thing that came to mind was you have a contract of employment and it includes allowances. And those allowances may be things like laundry for uniform and different things that are not now required. I will want you to tell me when we get to the question and answer what you think should happen with those things. Because you may have laundry allowance, well, telephone allowance would still be there because the cell phone will be in use. Another popular one could be traveling allowance. So think of those things because some of you may have contracts that include those things, but your staff, they're at home, they're wearing work, appropriate wear when they do the Zoom calls and so on. So they're not wearing the uniform anymore, or they're not wearing what they normally wear. They don't need the laundry allowance. That may be true, but we still need to remember we're saying the contract of employment remains. So somebody has to tell me what you think should happen with these things that persons can use. Remember, some people may have had entertainment allowance. What happens when the directive says restaurants, you're not open. Nobody is coming in to do business. You're doing it by Zoom. So the person still needs to entertain to get the business in. So they may very well do, I don't know, Zoom party, whatever. So it is putting an interesting spin on how we need to think when it comes to the contract of employment. And we will see that although legislation did not contemplate, contract did not contemplate COVID-19, by mere virtue of putting in what a human being would want to have or would like to have or would deserve to have in a contract of employment, you will see it still generally fits in. All right? Now, at the end of the day, for remote working to work well, we must all be practical, flexible, considerate, and available during working hours. Available during working hours not meaning the employer and not the employee, because I'm speaking to you as members of the association, principally employers representatives. The employee, yes, is the one who is there the 9 to 5 or whatever the hours of work are. A similar consideration has to be brought to bear also on the employer being available during working hours. And you will see there, I said during working hours, but at the same time, looking at being flexible, considerate, and practical. Because we know, given the fluidity of things and the pace with which things are happening now, sometimes things happen way before the workday starts, way after the workday ends. So flexibility, but at the same time, consideration on both the part of the employer and the employee. Now, a workplace in moving to remote working needs to have a definite plan, a definite policy. And the plans and policies will vary with the nature of the organization. There are some around that you will be able to have a look at. Some of the, I'm sure that your SBA research section perhaps would be able to source some templates and so on for you. Here from our end at the department, we don't have a template that we can share with you, at least not yet. But that is something that we want to move towards. Not necessarily a template, but looking at the things that you need to definitely consider when you are looking at your remote working plan or your remote working policy, both from the IR and safety and health perspective. Now, part of the plan, and I'm going to start to go a bit more quickly because I want you to be able to get in your questions and so on. The provision and availability of the appropriate equipment, supplies, and access to services. A question that comes up quite often is, can I have you're going to do remote working. Do you have a laptop or do you have a tablet or do you have a desktop? The person says yes, the employer says, well, you can use that. Not necessarily the best thing. Supplies, what happens to your stationery? A person needs to print, person needs to, you're using ink, you're using paper, you're sharing equipment with children or other persons who are at home doing a similar thing. Those are all things that the employer needs to speak with the employee about, have that dialogue and come up with the best possible arrangement. We looked a bit earlier at the management and monitoring systems. Accountability is still there. You're working at home, but business, as I said, has to go on. And it is also important in your plans and in your policies to still recognize achievements that are made, although the persons are not there in the building with you or not in front of you. A key consideration for some companies, and I believe in looking at technology earlier, you probably looked at this one, but the security of information, both the employer's data and the employee's data, one of those should be employee. So the employer's data, business data and so on, but then your HR, your IT, your safety and health committee, organization, those looking at those areas of the business that need to process and handle the workers' data, your plan and your policy should also consider that. Dialogue in the remote workplace is also important, again, in maintaining that connection, either as individuals or groups. And importantly, clear communication and discussion on expectations should be done before you start the remote working, as long as there's time to prepare. Last year, we didn't have time to prepare, but on subsequent occasions, we've had time to prepare. This time around, we did have some, so that was like the practice. So we had some time to prepare. And therefore, there's really no excuse for a worker or an employer not knowing exactly what is expected. Clear communication must be there on the part of both parties. Remember, the employment contract remains in place. Now, terms and conditions of work. Pay arrangements remain the same. The timing is the same. The quantum. Working at home doesn't mean that a person is working less. Generally, it means that persons are working more. That is what has been found, that persons are working more. They may not do everything or stick to the 9 to 5 or the 8 to 4:30, but you find that they are doing more, maybe past time. But one thing you need to be careful of, though, as small employers, is to listen when the employees throw out little hints, because from my own observation, I wouldn't say situation, maybe I should say situation, but from my own observation, hearing, some of the calls and so on, and just anecdotal evidence, not taking lunch is a usual thing, which is from a safety and health perspective, is not what you would want. So these are things that employees have to be trained up on, and you try to mimic the workplace as much as possible. Not that if you were used to taking 2 hours lunch, you do it when you're at home, but you try to stick to some good routine when it comes to that, tying back in with your wellness and the safety and health component and things like that. Vacation, sick leave, accommodating times for personal appointments, medical appointments, and so on. Those things we said remain. Now, working hours and working time. There may be a contractual time period. You work in X organization is from 9 to 5 or whatever. This can prove to be a little bit of a challenge with the remote work situation. It is not one where there is a black and white answer or ready-made answer. Each situation will need to be taken on its own merit for its own circumstances. And you look at what is happening, because in some cases, the nature of business has changed, not in the amount of what you're doing or the requests that you get, but the actual approach to working time has had to change because of the impact of the pandemic. Your workers, depending on where you are, may need now to be communicating more with suppliers who may be in different. Suppose you're a small business into supplying something. Because of the pandemic, it could very well happen. Supply chains have been disrupted, things of that nature. It may not be a question of interacting with suppliers and marketers and so on in a different way in different time zones, trying to source things that are not as readily available as they were from traditional markets. Now, not that we are saying here from the department's perspective, the ministry's perspective, that terms and conditions will or should change, but you still need to examine your usual workplace policy to make sure that those areas that may not be addressed by legislation are robust enough to withstand what is happening now. And when it comes to leave, not vacation leave, but leave, training leave, sick leave, different kinds of leave, that is one area that readily comes to mind. And as well, remember you're looking at the legislation and what happens in the context as well of your terms and conditions. You need to stick to what the legislation says. So with holidays, for holidays with pay act, for example, there may be a case where you're moving to remote work, and as an employer, you're trying to help the situation, which is commendable. But you may look at using holiday to help with the layoff situation, or holiday to tide you over coming back to the office, going from one directive into the reopening of businesses and so on. But you need to be mindful. By now, I am pretty sure, and I do hope that everyone would have heard um, the question of notice for persons who may need to be using that option, the question of engaging in dialogue with the employees, the question of getting their buy-in and getting their formal permission, written advisedly, when it comes to varying how the holiday may be broken up, more than one piece, more than two pieces, given out of cycle, things like that you need to be aware of. The Shops Act is another one that is there. And if there are persons like from the retail sector, for example, this really applies to you quite closely when it comes to looking at your working time and the terms and conditions, the basic terms and conditions that would apply to workers in that type of environment. We will turn next to the occupational safety and health, and I know that you want to have time to do your questions. And with occupational safety and health, in the context of remote working, without a doubt, the shared responsibility remains. The challenge is, though, you're working at home, and an employer may argue he or she does not have control over the person's home situation when it comes to workstation setup and where you put things and so on. You still do have some influence, you still do have some responsibility. The promotion of awareness and the emphasis on the adherence to rules and policies as far as is possible, that remains. Now, you may not be able to go to each and every workplace because you still need to, I say workplace, but home where the work is being performed. And there's still the question of respecting a person's privacy. And at the same time, it's not something that we have looked at yet legally, but I don't know if there may be one or two attorneys on the call, but your home is still your private home. And outside of having maybe a search warrant or something, a person will be able to say, I am coming to your home to see how you set up the workstation. So those are some of the concerns, some of the queries that we do get. But using examples from other jurisdictions, and even what we did in our own circumstance, an officer was having a difficulty with her setup, not being comfortable, and we did it by the trusty Zoom. Because it's not that you ask the person to have their home on show. This is the area where you are sitting. Just show me the positioning camera. You should use the phone. This is the chair. This is, where we'll do it. This is the table that I have set up. How best? So then the safety health officer was able to tell her, we'll use one cushion, use two cushions, use a different chair. And they were able to come up with something that made that officer comfortable. So that is an approach that can be taken, and there is nothing wrong with engaging if you have a safety health person on board, if it's your HR person who does it, using those approaches to still continue to promote your safety and health responsibility. But part of the preparation for moving home should include and must include preparation, not just in how to make this or how to order that or how to process this or how to address the customers, but also the safety and health component. Those basic things that persons need to know when you are setting up your workstation. So that brings us to the ergonomics and work design areas. And as you see there, they are of primary importance. the posture that you adopt, your even your environment. You encourage persons, not that you can do anything about it because that's their home, but temperature, lighting, ventilation, those things still remain of importance. And you try your best there to inform the person on those. Now, in not all at-home work or remote work situations involve computerized tasks. As I said, there's some that may be non-computerized. Although you may stretch that, it may be using your, as I said, your smartphone to do the work. You may not actually be keying or before a desktop or a laptop. So those are considerations that have to be borne in mind when it comes to occupational safety and health as well. Suppose it is a case of giving somebody the thing that you're going to make up. Suppose it can be done at home or assembled at home and so on. You will need to be absolutely careful that what the person is moving home to do is something that can be done safely in the environment. And that is where perhaps the employer would then need to insist on establishing whether certain things are in place and make the decision as to whether that non-computerized function can be moved home, or if he has to, wait it out a bit to see when things return to normal. In a case like that, that may be where you use the hybrid system, where you may not be able to get the person to come in 5 days a week because of the restrictions and so on, but that may be apt for to apply the hybrid system in a case like that. So when you're thinking about remote work, do not limit yourself to just the computerized work, but there's also non-computerized work. But you do need to be careful and consider whether that can be done safely, because should something go wrong, really I could see that it wouldn't be a case of a shared responsibility, but at the same time, I believe on the balance of probability, the odds may come down not in favor of the employer, because you have that responsibility to the employee under his or her contract of service to make sure that the work is done safely without any risk or threat to himself or others who will come into contact, as opposed to a contract for service. And at the same time and in the same breath, I would say, if you're moving tasks home, you are not going to be permitted to use then the contract for service approach, simply because you want the work done. That is probably the best way of getting out or copying out. I'm not saying that is what happens, but these are all things that can happen, whether it is intentional or not. But those are things that can happen. All right. The contract is portable. You go home, the contract goes with you. If you then decide that you want to take a different approach, then you go through and you do all the statutory things that you need to do. All right, which would include if you want to reissue new contracts, if you're going to operate differently, but the contract is portable. I can't say that enough. We touched a bit on the assessment of the workstation, remote, and the possibility of in-person if that is something that can be accommodated. If you have employees with disabilities, you need to consider, of course, what happens when they take the work home. Is it what they're doing? Can it be something that is done at home, or is it something that can be done at home? You will find that there are quite a few software packages around that enable persons with disabilities to function just as well or better than ourselves, or persons who may not be living with obvious disabilities. So you need to accommodate those persons as well. Bearing in mind, we now have the Employment Prevention of Discrimination Act. So you need to make sure that everybody is given a fair chance to do what they need to do without any thought of being discriminated against or being treated differently because of some characteristic or the other. in this case, disability, but there are other characteristics. Accidents and what happens there. Another 2 minutes and I'll be finished and go to your questions. But accidents, incidents, those will need to be treated on a case-by-case basis. We haven't had any reports yet, knock on wood. Everybody is operating safely. But one question that comes to my mind, you're doing a lot of work on the computers because the at-home work is mostly on computers. What then of hand-arm injuries? Because your workstation is not, it's not the best. So those are things that really the employer can try to stave off by still, as I said earlier, giving the guidance, making persons absolutely aware and being satisfied that persons are aware and understand what they're supposed to do. It may be within the means of some employers to do things like provide a chair. Not necessarily you go out and you buy new chairs, but just develop a simple system. You have the person sign out that they've taken home the chair. In some cases, depending on the workstation and the space the person has, they can do that. All right. But what you will need to do is to make sure that your insurance is also portable like the contract. So the person is taking the laptop, the desk, in some cases, the chair, in some cases, the printer, all those things have happened. You need to make sure what happens in relation to insurance. But we can go far away with the insurance. So one thing that comes to mind again as well, there may be persons who live in rented accommodation. Is this something that the landlord's insurance arrangements with, should something happen? We saw there was an incident about maybe a month ago where a young lady, she's working from at home, but there was unfortunately a fire at the home, so everything was lost. So in a case like that, the employer hopefully would have had the appropriate insurance and so on to deal with what happened. But those are some of the other matters that you need to look at. But when it comes to accidents and incidents, employees are still to be encouraged to let employers know what is happening. Let the employer know what is happening. And then you take anything there on a case-by-case basis. Same thing when it comes to ill health, doctor's notes, all those things still remain in place. You are still informing the employer. Mental and physical health, as I said, the mental health aspect is not my specialty, but I would encourage you, if you haven't thought of it already, maybe that can be another topic that you explore, because mental health is a concern in this setting, and it is affecting everyone. And the extended work day, the work-life balance, the blurring of lines, the tendency of some persons to be present but not really doing anything, sometimes because that is what they want to do, and sometimes because they're just not handling the situation well. The disconnect from the team, not seeing colleagues. It is at times like this now that persons are realizing you may not get along well in the office, but you still miss not being able to get along well. You still miss the interaction. Being able to talk to somebody, you don't agree, but being able to say what is on your chest to that person, you're understanding the value of that. And it is not the same thing doing it across a cell phone or on a Zoom call or a Teams call. And lastly, the maintenance of wellness. We have a multidimensional wellness policy that the ministry, there's an officer in the ministry who is working with that. But there are 9 dimensions, and it covers just about everything to do with wellness. So it's not just physical, but it's social, mental, spiritual, cultural, all those things that make up the wellness of an individual being, in this case, the worker. So maintaining wellness is something that is really within the purview of the employer as much as it is within the purview of the employee. And the collaboration and dialogue and so on that we spoke about earlier, that becomes important here when we're looking at the maintaining physical and mental health, because you want these persons to be able to return to work when we can do that, or to continue to perform as successfully as possible for their benefit as well as for the benefit of the workplace or the particular employer. All right, so I have taken you very quickly. As I said, I could have spent all day, and I feel like spending all day, but I can't. But taking you very quickly through some of the things that come up when you look at remote working. So you've looked at the technology, you're now looking at the world of work and how some of the things you consider: your contract, your safety and health, your terms and conditions, how the legislation supports or does not support the mental and physical areas, well-being and so on. So all those things go into remote working, and it is not just simply there's a directive, we can't come out, so take home the work and do X, Y, Z. There needs to be some planning that needs to be undertaken, and there needs to be some information and awareness on part of both the employer and the employee. All right, so with that, I can take any questions that may have come in, and I will spend the next 15 minutes or so with you. I know it is close to time, but I can spend a few more minutes with you just to take in some of those questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Mrs. Hope-Greenidge. This was an excellent presentation, I must say so, at the beginning of our Q&A segment. I'm sure that those on the call and even those who are watching via Facebook will agree with me that we've had a wealth of information shared here in this presentation as we look at the do's and don'ts of remote work. Uh, I'm going to remind you to please place your questions in the chat section. I have a few that we'll go through right now, but just to remind persons that we understand and appreciate that many of our businesses will consider the remote environment in the medium to long term. And so it is important for us, I believe, to have an appreciation for what we need to do, at least from a labor relations perspective. And I'll say, Claudette, you have uh, maybe opened up more questions than answers for me, because I've jotted down so many questions as you were going through, particularly the occupational safety and health segment. Um, and I know that there are a few others, based on the questions that I'm seeing here, who agree with me that this is an interesting area, and it begs the question about liability on the part of the employer. Because yes, the contract of service extends to the employee's home. So how liable then is the employer relative to incidents that may occur while at home, accidents that may occur while at home? Is there any liability on the part of the employer in such circumstances? That's the first question that came to mind as you shared on that bit. So I want to get your thoughts there, and then we'll go to the chat section and go through some of the comments from our members.
Well, on the question of what happens if there's, as I said, accident or incident, that is something that really has to be tested. It's not something that we have encountered. It is really not something that we have encountered. Remember, I said the legislation didn't contemplate these things. But in any event, though, every case will still be taken on its facts. For example, if a person trips over a power cord to the computer or something, in their house, how do we know that that computer is the one that you were using for work as opposed to one that the children or somebody else was using for work at home?
Mhm.
So that's what I mean when I say you need to look at every case and take it on its own facts. But the legislation did not contemplate something like that. When it comes though to something like something more specific, like say arm injuries, there is a possibility for, if you may say, a stronger argument on the part of an employer or employee for that matter, when it comes to something like that, because that's something that you can really measure. But when it comes now to you're at home and you're working at home, the real hardcore responsibility for safety and health is not something that the legislation contemplated, at least not in detail. And it is for that reason, one of the planks is that the employer must prepare, as I said, not just to move the computer home or move the whatever you're doing at home, but also have some sort of meaningful occupational safety and health training, awareness, intervention. And it is something that should continue through the period that you're working at home.
Yes, I quite agree. The pieces of legislation identified didn't contemplate remote work, and so that may be an area for the Ministry of Labor to look into and investigate further, and bring the necessary legislation to really address this matter. Because as I said, I foresee that many a firm will consider the remote regime in the medium to long term, as we anticipate that COVID-19 will be with us for some time, and maybe there may be other viruses along the way. So this is definitely an area that provides opportunity for us as we go forward. But here's a question from Jean Chase Seeley, one of our members. Do you see the possibility of employers having to pay a portion of employee telephone, electricity, and other bills as a result of this remote working environment?
All right. Now, if you look at a blanket approach would be, you can look at it in two ways. If there's a blanket approach through legislation, which will mean now that you are getting into what is the employer-employee relationship, and circumstances will vary. That is where, as I said, the importance of dialogue comes in. If there is the workers' representatives, representation at the workplace, like through the trade union or staff association, depending on what type of work you're looking at. But in your case here with SBA, it would be principally a workers' representative would be a trade union if that exists at the particular workplaces. Now, those are things that would come up through negotiation and bargaining and so on. So what can very well happen is, having the experience of this circumstance now, collective bargaining and negotiation may look different. I may now need to consider circumstances like this, because right now we're in a mode where, given how things are playing out, everybody is being as flexible and as accommodating as possible. But we need to consider how long that will continue, particularly as there are lots of examples from the world over. Yes, they have different means, but where persons will have been provided with, for example, if you call it an allowance or a grant or whatever, to purchase the appropriate chair or purchase the appropriate stand for the computer and so on. We, to my mind, I can't say with any certainty if or how that has been done in our setting, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was done in one or two cases. But as far as sharing the bills, not that I want to knock down an argument, but if you have Wi-Fi at home you have a telephone, you have TV. Generally, that's all one thing. So is the employer sharing the cost of a dedicated bill, or is he sharing the cost of your usual domestic bill? So those are some of the things that would need to be sorted out. I don't know, technology wise, I believe it may be possible where the employer may be looking at a dedicated service. I don't know if that is possible in technology, but I wouldn't be surprised, because you still need to consider how reasonable would it be for the employer to be sharing your Wi-Fi bill, for example, when really he has use of it, or you have use of it, or you use it, say 9 to 5, but then it is available the other 15 hours it would be, or whatever of the day, to other persons. So it is something that really needs to be considered in the dialogue at the workplace, as far as the sharing of bills is concerned, when it comes to things like electricity, telephone, and other things like that.
Mm. Okay, and desks and chairs and such like.
Desks and chairs and so on. Because
Mm.
you see, with the equipment, the setup, the computer and the desk and the chair and so on, there is nothing wrong as long as the person's home can accommodate it. You take home what you need to be comfortable. But then if that is not practical, and it will not always be practical, then at least make sure as the employer that you give the appropriate guidance, or you find the ways of making sure the employee gets the appropriate guidance when it comes to setup. With workstations, computer workstations, because as I said, that's the focus now for this at home work. Most people are doing computer-based work, but one of the easiest fixes you can have, probably the best fix you can have for a computer, for a laptop or desktop workstation, is a proper chair. Chairs are not like work surfaces that may be built in. The chair can move, but just make the proper arrangement so persons can have that. But generally, you get a good chair, a proper office chair, um, a person can become quite comfortable even at home.
Mm. Okay. I have about three questions here that are very similar, so I'll try to summarize.
Mhm.
These persons are really asking the question about how to really address a situation where the employer seems not um, to want to help their employee to be able to work and to be productive through the provision of appropriate tools. This is the summary really of these questions. The example cited is an individual here who the employer refused to give them a laptop, for example, to work with, and gave them some ridiculous long cord, to use at home with an existing computer system, which proved to be hazardous in the employee's workspace. So in summary, how do you really address the employers who refuse, it would appear, to give the employee the tools to work with in this new remote environment?
Now, remember we said in the presentation that the contract moves, the contract went home with you, or the contract goes home with you, if that is where the work is being done. So, and it is a contract of, you're not an independent contractor where you are providing your own computer or your own tools, your own printer. So the employer still has those responsibilities. So when you hear things like that, sometimes we need to go a little bit deeper and see why is this happening. But that's a different conversation. But on the surface, the employer asking you to continue, or permitting you to continue as an employee. Normally, the employer will provide desktop, laptop, whatever, that those basic things should still be part of the arrangement when you are moving to do the work from at home. But as I said, there's a lot of accommodation going on in the current setting. And I really do believe that when it comes to things like, like renewing agreements and bargaining and so on, that considerations will be a bit different. Different things may be asked for because we have seen what can happen. But in the case where the employer is really not, to your mind as the employee, something is not working, that is where you try to address it at the workplace. If nothing is happening, then you let us know.
Mhm.
As a
What?
labor department, you let us know what is happening so that you can get into some more detail. Now, there are persons who, based on agreement with the employer, for example, you still a contract of, you agree with the employer in any case. um, I have a desktop at home, I will use that. But I have seen in at least one policy where, yes, you can work from at home, but we, the employer, we are not taking responsibility for the things that you use at home. If it needs fixing, if it, we are not taking responsibility. So it goes both ways. But in the case where an employer is not cooperating, for want of a better term, that will take a bit more looking at, because there has to be some underlying thing there.
Yeah. Okay. Good response to that. I quite agree that the situation may need to be escalated um, to the labor department, because the employer has a responsibility to maintain his or her portion of the contract
Mhm.
of employment, providing the tools for the employee to work in the remote space. So um, I quite agree. So I'm going to encourage that particular individual who submitted that question to, maybe contact us directly, that we can maybe look into that situation. Here is Valis Agard um, asking the question, what or how would one treat to a situation where the landlord does not permit certain work to be conducted from the rented premises, thus making it impossible, obviously, for the employee to carry out their duties.
Right. That is one that, quite frankly, would be beyond us. Because yes, you have a situation where you are the employee, the employer has permitted you to bring your chair, your this, but the employer does not the employer, the landlord doesn't want it in his apartment or house or whatever. That is one that is completely now out of the realm, except our emphasis would be on how best then can you accommodate this employee to get this work done, or as employer, or as employee, what is the next thing I can do to facilitate getting this work done on behalf of my employer. um, in a case like that, if there is the provision where you can use the hybrid system, that is what you would need to fall to, because here is, you need to have the work done as the employee. The employee wants to do the work so they can earn an income and they want to help the company and so on. But there is this matter of the landlord tenant situation. You would then need to look at, as far as directives and restrictions may or may not allow, that person may then be one who would need to operate from the regular office where that is absolutely possible. But then you still need to consider the safety aspect of it, and to some extent the HR aspect of it. But for me, my bigger concern would be the safety aspect. Suppose that's the only person, is it practical then to have that person as the only one at a particular location? It may not be, because you're then dealing with a different consideration. But that would be outside. It's something that can happen, would be outside our realm, except to try to have the parties engage in some kind of discussion to see how best it can be accommodated.
Yeah. Okay. Let's take a few more. Do it quickly then. Julian is asking your perspective as CLO. Do you foresee renewed or revised HR strategies with respect to teamwork, building rapport, and morale now that the social environment has been removed due to the
The,
remote
the,
work?
there will be change, and there must be change. The persons who are going to come back to the notice I say come back because we will get back. The persons who will come back to the workplace are going to be different people. The persons who will be coming with all sorts of concerns. Strategies will have to change. Your recruitment strategies, I could see, will very well change. Not just because you may want more technology, these savvy persons know, but you may need to be looking. Suppose we having more or less locked down or going in and out of regular work for the last year and now a few months. Consider what retirements have you had, what resignations may have affected, the persons that you would have otherwise lost. How are you going to rebuild? So your strategy is, am I now rebuilding, recruiting the same way I recruited, or do I now need to recruit with the likelihood that there may be something like this that happens again, which they say is going to happen again, but we don't know when. So how are we going to recruit? The whole thing about building back better, that cliche, but how are you going to do it? So your strategies must change. Then for the persons who are now, you're now back to work, you're operating, even back to work in the office or back to work, you're continuing to work remotely. How are you going to deal with things? What strategies do you have for, reward and compensation? It is different. Persons can very well make the claim, we're working harder. So, is there anything that can be done? Any other benefits? Any other, not necessarily just money, but what can be done? Looking at things like teamwork, how are you going to continue to foster something like teamwork in a case where your persons are spread all over the country, small country, but they're spread all over. Um, those are things that your resource professionals I see should be thinking of even from this distance. And all like now they should be looking to see how they can make things a bit different, even as the situation is live right now, and not necessarily, oh, when we get back to the office or get back to the workplace, this is what we will do. But those things need to be, you need to be working at those things all right now.
Yeah, quite agree. Uh, I have two final questions. One has to do with the injuries that employees may actually incur, not from the perspective of the traditional occupational health, but like the eye strain and other muscular injuries and so on. What do you think employees ought to do vis-a-vis maybe the, I don't know, changes in their contracts, if any, at this time to address those kinds of injuries?
Well, as I said, in looking at the contracts, those that may be coming up for renewal, or you're looking at making things better. It may not be in a contract per se, but it may be some other benefit or program that the workplace has. There needs to be some consideration for those things. Yes, now we're seeing that screen-based work, I mean, we've always known, at least I have always known, we here at the department have always known, some persons that you call flicking through, they know that screen-based work um, comes with its complexities and its hazards. And doing screen-based work not only affects the eyes, but there's the matter of posture, your whole musculoskeletal system, depending on your setup. And when it comes to things like maybe what was the word? I test, ophthalmic examination and so on. those may not be things that you see in a regular contract now, because that's not something that was happening, but it may be something that needs to be addressed through regulation. And the Safety and Health at Work Act would provide for regulations to be made on just about any aspect of the working relationship that impacts on safety and health. So if in this situation now it is a matter of lots of screen-based work by persons other than just maybe a few sectors as before, well then that is something, as I said, can be addressed through regulation. When it comes to something like temperature and ventilation at home, there isn't very much you can do when it comes to regulation on something like that, but the other aspects certainly can.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this final one is not a question, but more so a comment. Shelley Nichols Hunt, who is an attorney at law, is weighing in on the earlier question about the restriction from a landlord, and is making the point that properties have restrictive covenants. And as a result, certain businesses, are not allowed on the property. So the reality is, it seemed incumbent on maybe the tenant to go through that contract for the rental of that facility to see if it is that there are certain types of activities that are not allowed there. There may be a restrictive covenant that the tenant needs to be aware of, and that would address, what that particular tenant or employee can do or should do relative to certain types of activity. But you're correct in making the point that it is really up to the conversation with the employer, I should say, and the employee in such circumstances to try to see what flexibility they can employ, what adjustments they can make.
When it comes
in
to
those circumstances.
in a situation, screen-based work. Thank you, Mrs. Nichols Hunt. The attorney, her name is Shelley Nichols Hunt.
Yeah, Shelley Nichols Hunt. That's right.
Right. Thank you. Thanks to her. Now, when it comes to screen-based work, well, screen-based work using a laptop or a smartphone or something, that is pretty much normal now, everyday occurrence. But the concern, as I said, would be those persons who may be doing something other than, you're bringing home certain things to be done. Well, yes, definitely. I didn't think of that, but restricted covenants, can be, but trying to use looking at the hybrid system to help, or applying the pure system, but still looking at, is it feasible enough, right? And then if it isn't feasible, then we go on. That's why I say it could be here for the whole day. If it isn't feasible, then you go on to what happens. You go into the other arrangements. Those are the statutory things, the holiday, the layoff, the this, the that. So it can go on.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, you did mention in your last slide the issue of mental health, and physical health and so on. Let me let you know, as well as some of the others, that our February webinar actually dealt with the issue of mental health, because we understand the importance of this to our firms at this point in time. So we did have Dr. Ermine Bell, who shared with us in our February webinar. So let me say to all those on the call, now, if you missed that, you can go back to our Facebook page, go to our website, www.sba.bb, and you can watch that webinar. Again, it's the February webinar where we focus on mental health. And this session today, we looked at the do's and don'ts of remote work. So, Mrs. Hope-Greenidge, I give you the final word. You want to share final thoughts with us as we close out this session today?
Yes, my final thoughts will be a bit of PR and some do's and don'ts. But I would encourage you to take the information on board. Remote work, it is not new. It is something that we have been forced into by unfortunate circumstances, you determine what is best for your organization, the pure, the hybrid. But what I want there to be some emphasis on is good old HR, IR practice. Speak with the employees, keep talking to the employees, engage them. Um, good ideas and examples come from maybe sometimes the most silent or the normally silent persons. So there's no black and white, no cut and dry way. It depends very much on the nature of the organization and the work to be done there. And with that, I will want to encourage persons to keep in mind the 28th of April, um, the World Safety and Health Day, which is the 28th, which is our Heroes Day. So we would normally do something either just before or just after. So you will look out for something the 27th or the 28th. And I encourage you to be involved in that. And also coming up this year is Occupational Safety and Health Week. So persons can add, just pencil in somewhere, could be like the first week of July or so, very end of June, very early in July, as Safety and Health Week. And of course, it will be virtual. So once we get that program sorted out, it will be circulated through, SBA and other publicly as well. So if you can just bear those two things in mind, and would want to encourage persons, the services of the department have continued. We're still here, albeit we're using the hybrid system. Some days we're here, some days we're not, but we're trying to continue as best as we can. It is all that's left now is for me to remind persons to, as I said, take on board the remote working concept for as long as we have to continue. Remember the rights and responsibilities of the employer, the employee, and one thing you must remember, the contract goes home with the person, as well as any support, IT, HR, otherwise that you need to give the person, and clear communication of the expectations on both sides would help the situation to go as smoothly as possible.
Okay, very well said. Thank you so much, Mrs. Claudette Hope-Greenidge, the Acting Chief Labor Officer with the Ministry of Labor and Social Partnership Relations, our guest speaker for this month's webinar as we looked at the do's and don'ts of remote work. I want to say a heartfelt thank you to all our members, our colleagues, our friends who joined us in this session today. Before we go, I'm going to ask you please to go to the chat section now and complete a very short poll, just a few questions completed in less than 3 minutes, I'm sure. Complete this short poll for us. This is going to help us with our overall assessment and improvement of our webinar series to be able to bring topics that are of interest to you, our key stakeholders, and also to get your feedback overall on the presentation. So please take a few moments now to complete the assessment poll. We've placed it there in the chat for you. Once again, we thank our special guests and we thank you for spending a part of your day with us. Remember that the Small Business Association organizes these monthly webinars as a part of our informational session, our education and training program to bring critical topics to the interest of our stakeholders to improve the overall management of our firms here in Barbados and beyond. I took note that Eves from Europe is on the call with us. We have our colleagues coming in from Trinidad and Tobago and other parts of the world. So we welcome you. We thank you for being here with us. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our webinar for today. If you've missed any part of it, please go back to the Facebook page. You can view it there again. You can visit our website there to see the slides from the PowerPoint presentation shared during this session. Please stay in touch. Please stay in contact with us. Let us know what are those issues affecting your business at this time. We are here as an association to represent the interests of micro, small, and medium enterprises. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you so much, Mrs. Hope-Greenidge, and we look forward to seeing you again on this same channel for another information session. Have a good
Okay.
day. God bless. Continue to stay safe. Bye bye for now.